Welcome to episode 5 of the Belief Books podcast. This is Josh Naiman, and this episode marks the start of yet another topic of my series. I want to talk to pastors, priests, ministers, or really anyone deeply rooted in a faith who lose it, or the other way around, who never believed and then became pastors, ministers, and devout believers. I name this topic Revision. I'm interested in the reasons for the change in their belief, especially at that scale. What caused the change? Was there a particular spark that we can trace that revision back to? I want to dig in.
So that was a long, slow journey, but I was determined that I was going to make it work because I was really looking to redefine myself and to escape the feeling of being stuck.
That's Trevor Spencer, a former minister. But he didn't leave the ministry because he lost faith. Instead, he found entrepreneurship. And now he helps run the most popular podcast out there on marathon training. We talk about his podcast a lot and running an online business. We also get into why he left the ministry because of it. He also talks about open theism, being a rebel, evolution, and creationism. We touch on wealth and faith. We also talk about something called servant leadership, if America should be a Christian nation, and he has an unexpected take on this. And, like all my guests, I ask him what would change his mind about believing in, for his case, the Christian God. So I've got to say, I really enjoyed getting to know Trevor and hearing his story and his outlook on his faith, and I think you will too. So enjoy the conversation. I didn't think fully about what this particular topic of my series would entail because I guess I locked myself into a frame of thinking where I'm going to be interviewing former pastors or ministers who have left their ministry or whatever because they lost faith, but I didn't think about interviewing people for other reasons. So this is actually perfect because I think it shows the dynamic of what's out there. Other reasons why people might change their trajectory in life. So you are my first remote guest to ever come on. So all my interviews have been in person. So you are kind of changing the way I do things. Not necessarily you, but it would have been someone else. But you're the first. So I kind of wanted to start out by figuring out, what you do day to day. You have the Marathon Training Academy.
Yep. My wife and I run marathontrainingacademy.com, where we help people train for a marathon. It could be their first marathon, or it could be a comeback marathon, or they just maybe want to get faster. My wife's a running coach. Her name is Angie, and she's done 51 marathons at this juncture. And I haven't done as many. I've done 14. I was kind of a desk potato when we started and not very into running at all. Really actually didn't like it. I did team sports when I was younger, but hated just running for the sake of running. So we started our podcast in 2010, and it was just me picking her brain because I knew she had a lot to offer folks because she's also a nurse, registered nurse. So when we started, she was the expert and I was the guy that was just sort of facilitating the conversation. I'm also the technical guy behind the podcast, so I was taking care of all that stuff and the website. And then I just got more and more into running and did my first marathon and then subsequent races. And it's sort of all documented on the podcast so people could be following my journey. And people listen to our show because they wanted to gain knowledge and expertise from Angie, but then they related to me because they saw themselves in me because I was a newbie runner and desk potato prior to starting this, and just keeping it real. I'm not I'm not an elite runner. I'm just a middle of the pack marathoner. My fastest marathon time is 3:56 or 3:58, I think. So I haven't run fast enough to qualify for Boston like my wife has, and it's the struggle is real.
That sounds like a perfect combination.
Yeah, there's this dynamic there, exactly, in this chemistry that just worked right from the beginning, and we just grew an audience, and we have wonderful folks that listen to us, a great audience that just keeps us motivated, and we've been doing it now for 8 years.
Wow. Well, congrats with that. That's
that makes
awesome.
us old in podcasting years.
Yeah, I'm about maybe 2 months old, technically, but I've been working on my series for about 2 years.
Oh, wow.
Right. Yeah, technically my birthday's not even 2 months.
Right on, man. The good thing is that you started.
Yeah, no kidding. I think that's with anything, right, is getting going.
That's right. Putting it out there and hitting that button, that publish button, it can be intimidating because you don't know how people are going to take it, how the world's going to respond, but just putting it out there and being able to connect with folks and seeing an audience grow around a podcast, it's one of the greatest experiences of my life.
I would agree. Yeah, I've already had feedback trickle in, and it's every time I read it, it just makes my day. And it's like, okay, I guess I should continue on. Actually, just yesterday, I had my first feedback where someone said, this actually is starting to change my mind. And this early on, I feel real good about that because not only did it change someone's mind, but they were able to say that on the Facebook group.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, that was a pretty cool experience. So I'm glad that we got to know what you're doing in your day-to-day. But speaking of changing minds, so before you started your entrepreneurial journey, maybe bring us back to how you got to reaching out to me about your former or your past.
Yeah, you put the word out that you were looking for former pastors, and I said, I'm a former pastor. It's not. I didn't leave the faith. I'm still active in church as I guess what they would call a lay leader. An unemployed leader in the church. But I was a pastor for about 12 years, actually started a church, a Baptist church in a small town in Missouri, where I happened to be working with a youth program, residential faith program for at-risk teenagers. And, the reason why I'm not doing that anymore, I just felt like even though my training was, and my education was all pastoral studies and theology, and I had prepared, most of my adult life to do that. It just didn't seem like to me it was the best fit for how I'm wired, how my brain and heart work. I kind of always had an entrepreneurial bug in me that I just wanted to explore, and having to be tied down. Really, it's kind of a wanderlust too. I love to travel, and I guess if I could distill down my personality to anything, it's I'm a rebel, and having to stay tied down at one job or one church anywhere, and because when you're a pastor, you can't really travel over the weekend too easy, and it can be pretty demanding life. I mean, some people think, well, pastors only work on Sunday, but really that there's so much time and prep that goes into the weekend services, plus the other duties that a pastor has, and the pay is not very great. I mean, I was working at a nonprofit boys' home, and then I had a little bit of money from pastoring, but up until my 30s, I was essentially below the poverty line as far as my income. And here I had a wife and 3 kids. My wife was a nurse, but she has been a full-time stay-at-home mom since the first kid. So we could have had more money, if she went back to work, but it's not what she wanted to do. And we got by. I mean, God took care of us. The people took care of us too. I mean, we had very, it's not like we were suffering, but I wanted to make sure I had some retirement. I didn't want to just be a greeter at Walmart when I got to be in my later years. I wanted to explore the world. I wanted to kick back on a beach and start saving. So I felt like I needed a side hustle and sort of a new direction in life that kind of more fit my rebellious nature and my curiosity and my entrepreneurial nature. So that's how I got into online business and podcasting and building Marathon Training Academy.
That's a wonderful story. I would imagine that a lot of people get stuck. I mean, even not pastors, but just in life in general, people go one way and it's really hard to get off those tracks and pop to a different set of tracks. And so I commend you for, making that decision. Was there like a moment where things were clicking in the entrepreneurial sense way more than what was fueling you in the ministry?
Well, what you said about getting stuck, that's kind of how I felt. I had 3 kids. Money was tight. We're living paycheck to paycheck. I was living in Missouri, and I'm not from there. I'm originally from California, and my wife is from Montana. So we had no family in the area. And it was only temporary. Like, there was just feeling of unsettledness because we knew we weren't going to be there forever. We were just sort of there for a short-term basis to get this church started. But I read a book by Tony Hsieh, who's the founder of Zappos. I think at least he's the CEO of Zappos, and he wrote a book called Delivering Happiness. And it's all about his company story. But in the end of the book, he gives frameworks for what is it that makes human beings happy. Apparently, it's a hobby. He has an interest to study, the psychology behind happiness. And it's relationships, and it's a lot of that. But one thing that stood out to me in the book is we have to see ourselves making progress. If you feel like you're stuck at a dead-end job, you're probably not very happy at your job. If you feel like you've hit the ceiling. And that's kind of how I felt. I felt like the organization I was at, I had gotten to the top of, and there wasn't really anywhere else to go. There wasn't any more money to be made, certainly, and that's not why I was in it anyway. But I just felt like there had to be more. There was something more for me to contribute to the world, and other dreams that I had that I want to pursue. So I was determined to make it work. And it wasn't a matter of like I had a business breakthrough or some other breakthrough. I mean, it was a long slog to get to be full-time online. It's not easy to make a living as a podcaster. So that was a long, slow journey, but I was determined that I was going to make it work because I was really looking to redefine myself and to escape the feeling of being stuck.
Sure, yeah. My entrepreneurial, like my business thing kicks in, and there are a lot of pastors, or, Joel Osteen comes to mind, where he is extremely wealthy, and so I thought, you started a church, maybe there was another ceiling to be had in another church that you could start, but was there a conflict, like mixing business with this faith side of things where you wouldn't have felt right about that? Or was there something holding you back from growing your community to other communities and starting other churches?
Yeah, that's a great question, man. For one thing, I just didn't feel like I was very good at that. I felt like I excelled at teaching and theology and explaining things to people. As an administrator, I wasn't that good. And I think if a church is going to grow, if you're going to start satellite churches, if you're going to, grow into a mega church or even a solid congregation of 500, you've really got to have some gifted administrators. And I do better as a solo entrepreneur, working for myself. And I don't think I'm ever going to be the head of a big company or a big organization. I wouldn't mind being on the board of one. I kind of joke with my wife. We drive by and we see businesses and restaurants. And I love Mexican food, and when you love food, you think, well, and you watch these kitchen shows and cooking shows, you're like, man, maybe I can open a restaurant someday. But man, who would want that nightmare, right? So my dream would be to own the building that a restaurant leases.
Absolutely, that's thinking.
Yeah, don't have to manage as many people day to day. So there are extremely wealthy, famous pastors and. I mean, that's just definitely a small fraction, and they're basically they became best-selling authors. You've got Rick Warren, who his book The Purpose-Driven Life sold 20 million copies. I mean, it was like record-breaking book in any genre when it was written. Interesting. Have you ever looked at that book?
I have not.
I bought it back in the day. I wasn't really a Rick Warren fan or in that circle, but the book was everywhere, so I found a copy at a secondhand store and looked into it. It's interesting how a lot of times you can just take old ideas and sort of make them fresh. It's nothing revolutionary or earth-shattering in the book. It's just, hey, God has a purpose for your life. How long have Christians been saying that? For 2,000 years. But it really kind of is packaged well. Of course, it's Rick Warren, who already had a massive audience, so the marketing angle of it was fascinating to me. Sometimes you can just unearth old ideas and principles. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, but just find things that have pretty much universally been proven to work for people on a psychological level and spiritual level, and then tell some new stories and use modern language, and maybe you'll have a bestseller.
But you don't see any conflict with making money and making if someone wanted to become wealthy while spreading their faith, there's no conflict with God about that.
It just depends on the motives. That's a good question, right, though, because when I first started realizing that I like the pursuit of wealth, in the sense that that's a great goal for me, I do, and pretty much for me, money equals freedom. That's why money's important to me, because I feel like if I have it, then I'm free to do things. I'm free to do things for my kids. We're free to go places. And as a rebel, if I keep coming back to that, it might be because we just interviewed Gretchen Rubin, who wrote the book, The Four Tendencies, and one of her personality tendencies is rebel. And on the test, that's what I got. So I know that about myself, that have a tendency to view the world through a rebel's eyes. And for me, it's freedom. That's what's most important. And money provides that. So when I began to realize that this was what my nature was, there was this tension, between the work I was in and my faith, and maybe how I viewed certain verses in the Bible, versus these feelings I'm having. There's certainly a scarcity mindset that exists in some Christians and in some churches. Maybe if you go to more of the primitive denominations, some Baptist denominations, maybe some that lean like Anabaptist would maybe have this. Maybe some mainline Protestant denominations, I don't know. If you're talking about charismatic denominations and Pentecostals, like you mentioned Joel Osteen, they wouldn't have the same view of it. They kind of more, I think, err on the other side, which is this prosperity gospel that, God wants us all to be wealthy, and all you got to do is have more faith, and it'll show up. Send in your money, and you'll get it back tenfold. That kind of stuff. So I'm definitely don't believe in the prosperity gospel, yet I don't think that we can look at the teachings of the Bible and the teachings of Jesus and walk away with a scarcity mindset either. And I had a scarcity mindset and a lot of negative emotions around money that I had to unpack and deal with. And a great book that I read was called, I read Think and Grow Rich. I read Rich Dad, Poor Dad in the beginning. But as far as from a spiritual author, Thou Shalt Prosper by Rabbi Daniel Lapin. Have you ever heard of that book?
I have not.
So here's a Jewish rabbi. He's probably a multimillionaire, best-selling author, but he explained how the rabbis, and I guess and within Judaism, how they viewed work as providing service, and that money being, a fair exchange for value that you provide to the marketplace. And so they had they have a more wholesome view of the dignity of work. They don't just divide, I think this maybe traces back to the days in which there was a division between the priesthood and the laity in the church. This is more sort of a Roman Catholic thing, whereas there was spiritual work and then there was secular work. And the spiritual work, if you did that, if you were a priest, if you were in the ministry, you would be more connected to God. In fact, in those days, I just finished reading a new biography about Martin Luther, by Eric Metaxas. And, in the 1500s, if you wanted to get closer to God, a lot of times you would just go become a monk, go start doing spiritual work. The mundane work of building tables or working in the mines or being a baker, that wasn't necessarily viewed as spiritual work in which you could glorify God. Now, the Jews, they never thought that way, apparently. According to this Daniel Lapin, they viewed all work, as long as it's not morally wrong, we're not talking about like prostitution or something, but all morally acceptable forms of employment as being a form of worship and having a dignity about it. So that was a helpful book for just sort of rewiring the way I think about money. Of course, I'm still, as a Christian, I still am aware of the verses about greed and about covetousness, because, that can destroy one's life. So
absolutely.
Definitely a balance.
Yeah, that's I wasn't sure exactly where this conversation would go, but it seems like I'm trying to put myself in your shoes or someone's shoes like this, and I think that would be a big hang up for me is, okay, well, I'm making all this money, I should help others because that's what Jesus would do, or insert character here, like I should give this all back to help humans. And so there's that conflict for me, putting myself in those shoes, is where would I stop giving and just receive, or where would that line be?
We've always given at least 10%. I hope that doesn't sound like braggadocious. It's pretty much a established Jewish and Christian principle. It goes back to the Old Testament. As a follower of Jesus, I don't believe I'm bound to Old Testament laws now, but there are still principles that are there that have informed the way that Christians have thought about, at least a minimum to give of their income. Probably if you took the average, like if you looked at a Gallup poll, or who's that guy that's always polling in the Christian world? I forget. If you look at some of the polls about like what percentage of income Christians actually give, I'm sure on average it's less than 10%, but it is. Now, my apologies if this sounds wrong to any of my secular friends. Christian groups on average are pretty much the largest givers to charitable organizations, whether it's like hurricane relief or money being sent overseas.
I've heard that as well. Do you think that could be inherent from the sheer numbers? Not that's an important thing, but do you think just because there's obviously a significant more number of believers that those numbers would reflect that, or do they I guess we'd have to look at the data.
I think it's per capita, so I'm not talking like number of the total amount of money given, but percentage of those various faith groups who are giving. And I think that's because in the New Testament, we do have a very strong, and the Old Testament too, we have a very strong mandate to be generous. And especially, if you go to the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, if you have 2 coats, give to him that has none. And take care of your neighbor, and even to bless your enemy. I mean, that was revolutionary when that was said back when the Romans were in power, to love your enemy. And of course, there's these, the parable of the Good Samaritan, and lots of these great parables. So I think for me, if I'm not generous and if I'm not giving, then I'm probably too self-focused, and it's easy to become that way. I mean, it's not like I always enjoy writing those checks, but my wife, she's a great example for me, because she's such a giving person, and her parents are too. And I think that was modeled for her as a kid. So they've always been like faithful tithers. And her dad is a police officer or retired cop. So they don't, police officers, and especially in small towns, they don't make a lot of money. But he was always so generous with birthday gifts and Christmas gifts. And he's one of those guys you cannot buy the meal when you're eating. Like he'll like wrestle you to the ground.
At that point, I just give in. Okay, I'll get him back some other way.
Yeah, I give in. I think I'll just let him have the blessing, and I will let him pay for the food.
That's nice. I would think that I wanted to mention it, that your blessing, I would imagine, is probably inspiring a whole lot of people, because you said you had quite large numbers for your amount of listens of your podcast. You've probably changed some lives, transforming their health.
Yeah, we've had some amazing stories and some amazing emails. And almost every week we get emails like this, because we have a pretty good sized audience. We have the largest podcast on marathon training and one of the largest shows on running. And we just have great audience members. I mean, they're very supportive, And here's what was amazing, Josh, is when we started the podcast in 2010, I was still a pastor because I was doing that until 2014. So I did both for a few years. And I was amazed at the way that people would hear our podcast and just take action on it. And I wasn't quite as used to that being in a church setting because I'm giving out content every weekend, but sometimes not seeing any results, not seeing any movement, not seeing any progress. Some, right. People's lives change slowly, and you got to bring people as far as they'll let you take them. But it wasn't the same way with our podcast audience. Like right from the beginning, we started hearing people that were like, "Hey, I love that tip. That was awesome. I implemented that, and it really helped. And I got faster. And I set a PR, a personal record in the marathon, or some story like that." Yeah, I think our listeners know that we're Christians, but it's not like we proselytize or anything on the podcast. Because we want it to be a show that's, open for everybody. And, we reveal things about our personal life, but it's definitely not to any degree that would alienate listeners, I hope. So we've heard from people from all walks of life. And we have a group of paying members that we personally support and train. And at any one time, there's lots of Christian people. There's also completely secular people. There's Jewish folks in there. There's one lady right now who's a Muslim who lives in, where's she living? I forget Singapore. A Muslim lady who lives in Singapore. It's just amazing the amount of people that a podcast can reach. I've never been to Singapore, but podcasts no boundaries. So
cool. I have been to Singapore in 2008.
I'd love to go someday.
It was nice. It was one of the first places I traveled out of the country, but that's a whole nother story. Maybe one day I'll get to share that story and how I ended up in Singapore in a future episode or something. I think I'll eventually end up doing a topic actually about volunteering or giving your time and how important that is. But like I said, that's a whole other story. So I plan on producing this podcast indefinitely, regardless if I make any money from it. But I can't tell you how special it is to already have supporters this early on, people who already believe in me and what I'm doing. And it gives me a lot of extra motivation and resources to do more of this and take it as far as I think I can. I also want to make the quality better for your ears, although I hope this is just fine for now. So, thank you to my official patron listeners. So that is Greg Naiman, Nana Naiman, and Eric Roche. My readers, Meltem Yetis, Serdar Yetis, and Berk Yetis. And my publishers, Hyundai Naiman, Mark Naiman, Bill Marpom, Nectar Gems, Benjamin C. Stout Photography, and the newest one, Stand Wrap. Thank you all so much for your support. And since I know that I actually have quite a few listeners in Turkey, and some of those listeners are supporters, çok teşekkürler. And just so you English speakers know, that means thank you very much in Turkish. I'm working on it. If you like what I'm doing, you can support me too, for as little as $1 per month on Podbean's Patron program. You can find more information about that and how it works and what you get on Podbean or the support page of thebeliefbooks.com. But anyways, let's get back to the conversation. So I've seen a lot of podcasts who are pastors who are doing sermon type podcasts, and that was not surprising. Once I saw it, this podcasting realm, for the last year, I've just been, my mind's kind of been blown as I dive really deep on the potential and the opportunity that's out there, just like you saw. And so it's kind of cool because I would imagine some of your older satisfactions or gratifications, if that is it, when you give a sermon and when you're talking to your church, you get a reward like, I'm connecting with these people. Now you get that in an international way, which is kind of cool. I would imagine that satisfies a part of your brain that was similar to that experience earlier.
Yeah, it is. It's harder to not see the people. So when I was doing a sermon, I couldn't edit it. It was in real time. And with
Right.
our podcast, we do edit. So there are some things that are different, some things that I miss about teaching a live audience, but I still have opportunities to do that now and then. The gratifying thing that I've always enjoyed about being a speaker, and it's just equipping people. It's just part of my teacher's heart. I was not one of those pastors who did like moralistic sermons or fluffy kind of like feel good. I wanted to give like the nuts and bolts of theology, of the context of the passage, the historical background, like just geek out on it, really. I guess I'm a theology nerd. And people seem to appreciate it. I don't know if that's the best recipe for growing a church big, but it seemed to feed the people well that came. And it was just the love I have for equipping, and a podcast is a great venue for that as well. Although my wife is more of the person that gives out the content, and I'm just more there for comic relief and telling stories and asking follow-up questions and interviewing guests and stuff.
That's perfect.
I'm definitely not as much of an expert on running as I feel like I am on theology.
That probably is why people subscribe to your podcast. Yeah, they get the tip of running here and there, which is wonderful and tangible, but I'm sure they grow in other ways by learning about you guys. And my wife and I have talked about starting a podcast now because we travel a lot. So maybe I can pick your brain about how you make that work later off the air.
Yeah. Would it be a travel podcast?
Something like that. Maybe also spritz of immigration, because she's from Turkey. And so we've gone through the whole process of that and are still in the process of, getting her citizenship and all that. So I would, just like you were saying, there can be a lot of tips and tricks with that, as well as our travels. You could go here and stay here and it could be cheaper. But that's a whole nother idea. Our listeners will both have to wait for that. I have a couple notes that you had sent me about things about you that were off the beaten path of mainstream Christianity. So I wanted to kind of pick your brain about this. And the first thing is, I had never seen this label, but you had mentioned that you consider yourself an open theist when it comes to God's knowledge. Could you clarify that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So this is not mainstream at all. Here in Western Christianity, we've been more influenced by the thinker and writer Augustine, who was a church father, and we have a way of viewing God through that prism. And what happened was Augustine, he had a radical conversion. He was a young man who was in all kinds of just trouble and decadent lifestyle, it sounds like, but always very intellectual and always seeking. And he had studied a lot of Greek philosophers and other sort of cultish type religions at that time. And then Augustine became a Christian, and he's a brilliant thinker. I mean, there's one of his books, City of God, that is a hard read. It's pretty dense, but interesting to get through. His book Confessions is probably they say that's the first modern autobiography in a modern sense, like what we would consider autobiography. But anyway, what Augustine did was he took Christian teaching, and then he took Greek philosophy, and he synthesized the two so that people began to define God more in a classical sense, saying, well, God is omniscient. He knows everything. He's omnipresent. He's everywhere at one time. All these omni words, omnisapient, all-wise, and omnipotent, especially that one, all-powerful. And not only that, but God is unchanging. He's immutable, and because he's unchanging, that means he's impassible, meaning he cannot be affected emotionally. He's in this consistent state, and his creatures, since God is unchangeable, can't really influence his state of being or his state of mind one way or another, because that would be the creation acting upon the creator. And what kind of creator would you have if the creation could, change maybe the mental state of the creator? So that classical view of God, that would kind of really traces back to Plato and his theory of forms. If something is perfect, therefore it has to be changeless in Plato's mind. And the way that we know about changing things on earth is that there are unchanging things beyond in the spiritual realm. So there's this form that is changeless. So an open theist says, well, hang on a second. Should our view of God be influenced by Plato and be influenced by Augustine and classical thinking, or should it be influenced by the reading of Scripture? Because in Scripture, you do see God changes. He changes his mind. I think there's 13 instances in the Old Testament where it says that it repented God that he did this or that. In other words, that he changed his mind and his course of action. The first time was I think you'll find that is in Genesis 6, where it says violence had overspread the earth and people were, basically killing each other, from my imagination, and rape and pillage and kill and all that. And it says that God, it grieved him at his heart, and it repented him that he created man, and then decided to send the flood and sort of start over with Noah and his family. So then you bring in the Noah story. But the language of a repented God, or that is that he changed his mind, is in there about 13 times in the Old Testament. And then we see other instances in which God seems to change his mind or change his plans. So that started people thinking about, well, is God really impassible? Is he really immutable in the classical sense? Or does God change when it's beneficial to change for his creation? Because part of being compassionate and merciful is to put up with people and to adapt to them. So if God is a God of love and compassion and mercy, then he would have to be changing to the degree in which he needs to respond to his creation. So when it comes to, this is probably getting too long and boring, so I'll just wrap it up. When it comes to open theism, that's concerning God's knowledge. How does God view the future? And really, what does the future consist in? The classical view is that God knows everything that's ever going to happen. He has this omniscience that can be defined as exhaustive, definite foreknowledge. So God knows everything that's going to happen with a definiteness and with an exhaustiveness. Every single event in human history, it's already been written like a blueprint. Whereas an open theist would say, no, the future has possibilities. There are some things that are definite, but other things that are not, other things that are open to a realm of possibility, and the future doesn't exist yet in some sense because it hasn't been created. It's being created as we're moving through time. So an open theist believes that possibilities are real and God knows them as such. So it's possible. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, technically, going back to when you were describing the Bible and that God changed his mind about one course of action 13 times, even if it was just once, if that is true, then logic would follow that he didn't know that, unless he's playing a game, and like acting, that, yeah, I changed my mind. But if he really did change his mind, then he actually didn't know before that he was going to change his mind, or else he would have changed the thing before he started it. So it sounds like to me, this open theism is that God is this creator and essentially hit these first dominoes. Maybe there's major dominoes in there that he knows are going to be hit throughout it, but many of the dominoes are just going to fall. How they fall is maybe unknown with that entity.
Right. Good analogy. And let's say we have dominoes coming from all different directions. I mean, this is like an OK Go music video, right? We have all kinds of things being set in motion. And God set up the table, but he's not necessarily setting everything in motion because he gave his creatures a free will. So we are enacting change in the world. We are setting off dominoes and ripple effects that are affecting the whole cosmos, the whole system. So how does one action really get amplified out throughout time? It's impossible for any of us to know at this point, because my actions are causing other people to react, which is causing me to react. And it's just sort of this chaos theory of things that it's impossible for me to know even the whole history of a rock. I mean, if I walk outside and find a rock on the ground, I might know what type of rock it is. I can ask a geologist and they can say, well, it broke loose as the glaciers were coming through and carving this out. But then you ask, well, where did those come from, and what bigger rock was this small rock part of. No one even knows the whole complete history in a definite way of one single rock on this earth. You know,
Right.
We have assumptions and we have a general idea of how things went. But if our knowledge is so limited, it's presumptuous of me to ever think I would know the reason why someone suffers, why a car accident happens, why a drunk driver, hit and killed someone. But these are the sort of presumptuous things sometimes Christians say, and the way they say it, and this is going back to the classical view of God, that God controls everything in their thinking. They'll say, well, God had a plan. God's in control. And that might be comforting for some people to hear that, but other people, it's like, ooh, man, if that's the kind of God that you're talking about, that's causing children to suffer and drunk drivers to hit innocent.
Exactly. That causes more questions in my mind than it answers. But, I think this way of looking at it is a little more fluid with what we see actually playing out, because it really, for me, it would be hard to worship someone who had planned some of this stuff. It's just hard to see that, those three pillars, like you're saying, all knowing, all loving, and all powerful, that cannot be true because of what you see playing out, unless we're defining love very differently.
Right. And I don't think that's where people get it wrong is love. I think love is usually defined correctly. If people go back to especially the parable of the Good Samaritan and loving your neighbor and selflessness, usually it's how we define power, the omnipotent part, that I think Christians have got it wrong, and where I think the open theism argument is compelling. Because if we define power as determinism, that God divinely determines everything that happens on earth, every molecule that vibrates is directly being acted upon by God. And that's sort of a Calvinist way of thinking. Calvin believed that, in election and predestination, that God even determined who would go to heaven and who would go to hell, and basically everything that would happen in your life. If God is only powerful to the degree that he determines and controls everything, is that really what we see in the Bible? Because it seems like there's a lot of things that are getting out of hand, and a lot of things seem to be outside of his will.
Or even prayer. What would be the need for prayer?
It'd be totally pro forma. Even C.S. Lewis, who I really admire, and he was a great thinker, I think his view on prayer was sort of stuck on the Calvinist. He said, prayer doesn't affect God, but it changes us. So basically prayer is pro forma, it's like therapeutic. But I think that prayer does affect things. If there is a God and he created us for relationship with him, and as morally free agents in relationship, we can affect one another. So I think prayer is more than just a pro forma self-therapy kind of thing. But that's a good point. Sure. You're thinking like a theologian.
I've watched a lot of debates. I'm interested in this discussion, hence my series. Yeah. So when you were a pastor, did you have this same mindset? Were you an open theist and have these same views as now? Or when you got out of that, did things start to change?
I appreciate that question. I had a really dramatic conversion, come to Jesus moment. I was in a lot of trouble as a teenager. I was rebelling against my parents, and I got kicked out of school when I was selling drugs. Apparently, they don't like you to do that at school. So my parents were just at the end of their wits. And I'm not from a religious family at all, but for some reason they had heard good recommendations about a Baptist boarding school in Missouri. So at 14, I got sent to live there, and it was kind of militaristic. It wasn't quite like a military school, but definitely a lot of discipline, early mornings, lots of work, a uniform, all that stuff. So it was quite a culture shock being from the California public school system, never even having really left the state. And then here I am in Missouri at this regimented Baptist boarding school. And they were fundamentalists too in their theology. So there were some people there, though, that I really connected with. I really knew that loved me. And especially some guys in the dorm whose lives had been changed. They didn't want to talk about any of the things I wanted to talk about. All I wanted to do was talk about Jesus. And these are guys that had been just like me. So I came to Christ in that boys' home and then began to learn everything I could, just soak it up like a sponge, because I had no religious background. I had not even cracked a Bible open to read, at least, until I'd gotten to that boys' home.
What age was this?
14.
Okay.
The only time I'd ever had a Bible previous to that was leaving junior high. There were some people passing out New Testaments, and I took one and I pulled out a page because I didn't have any cigarette rolling paper. And I was told that you can roll a good joint on a New Testament page if you didn't have any zigzags. So that's what I did. And that was my only exposure to what was even in the Bible previous to going to that fundamentalist Baptist boys' home. But I knew the people were genuine. They really showed me a lot of love and patience, and I turned my life around there. But I did take on a lot of baggage as far as like my view of God and my view of the world and my view of life, just more rigid fundamentalist categories. And so it took me quite a few years to unpack a lot of that stuff. Yeah, there's like things like, oh, I don't think I really believe that. For example, one of the, maybe you say you've watched a lot of debates. Here we have debates going on between creationism and evolution. Well, I was originally exposed to young earth creationism there, but in such a way that it's kind of like there's a guy named Ken Ham, Answers in Genesis, and he sets up this dilemma for people. He says, unless Genesis is literal and young earth creationism is true, then the whole Bible is a book of lies. How can you trust the whole Bible if you can't trust 6-day creationism? So you kind of put people in a corner of young earth creationism, and you make them think that the whole house of cards will fall if we cannot prove 6-day creationism, which is unfortunate, I think, false dilemma to put Christians in, or anybody. So I began to read theologians like C.S. Lewis, like Tim Keller, one of my favorite theologians from Redeemer Presbyterian Church. And these guys believe in evolution. You know, they're theistic evolutionists. I'm like, here my brain is exploding. I had no category for that. Because here were guys that were so good on the gospel and on theology and on scripture, yet they believed in evolution too. So it got me out of my false dilemmas. And there's a lot of false dilemmas when it comes to, I think, the faith, especially when you're young. You know, I was 14 when I went there. I was 16 when I left. And I turned my life around, but there were a lot of things I needed to unpack and say, do I really believe this? Is this essential to being a follower of Jesus? Or is this just some other like legalistic baggage that can be just left aside? So I don't think I even heard about open theism until probably 2015. I don't think I even heard the term until then, maybe 2014.
Yeah. I think, for me, it was, I was raised Catholic. I went to Catholic school until I was in 8th grade, wore the uniform, did the thing, but I certainly was a rebel. I mean, now I'm outside of that and I'm normal, like a normal rebel, but in that, I wore different shoes and I got sent down to the principal's office and I stood my ground and I was like, these are nice shoes. What's wrong with my shoes? And they let me wear those shoes for the rest of the time. But anyways, I think that a lot of people, again, back to the word getting stuck, they think, my belief is X and it can't have any bit of Y or Z or C. And the evolution thing is huge. That was big when Charles Darwin started to come out with these ideas. But I think that it's nice for people to hear that, hey, you can believe this too, because with evolution, as much as people want to think something else, it's not a matter of belief. It's something like gravity. You don't believe that gravity's a thing. It just is a thing, until otherwise someone comes out and wins a Nobel Prize to prove that differently. We're pretty sure that evolution is a real thing. So in my view, I don't think belief is actually a good word. And it's funny that I chose that word in my series title, but it's a nice catch-all. But some things really aren't a matter of belief. You accept it based on, do I have good reason for this or not? And then you don't choose usually to believe something.
I agree somewhat. I might push back a little.
Please.
I think that even in reason, there is at some point a degree of faith. Like, you have to commit, and you trust that it's true. You don't have all the data, absolutely, but there's a preponderance of evidence. The data points toward this. Yeah. We can never be completely certain about anything. I mean, Descartes said, "I think, therefore am I. I know I exist because I'm thinking, and I'm thinking because I exist," and that's about all there is that I know about life. Period. And the philosophers have talked about how it's even hard to prove that you're a human being, a thinking, conscious human person, not just kept alive by a machine or maybe a caterpillar imagining that you're human. But of course, I think, I agree that there's a preponderance of evidence that points to, what Darwin said, the origin of species and natural selection. And I think that for a Christian, it's fine. It's fine. It's totally fine to believe in that and to also be a follower of Jesus. Because when you set up the criteria for your faith about being certainty and the rightness of your belief, and you put a lot of confidence and a lot of spiritual maybe and psychological weight on the being right, the rightness of your belief, the certainty of your belief, you've created an idol, really, an idol of certainty. And for a Christian, we're commanded not to have any idols. We're not to put any of our hope and trust in something greater than God. Not myself, not the certainty of my beliefs. As a follower of Jesus, I'm not secure to the degree in which I'm certain that everything in the Bible is true, or certain that this one doctrine is true or not. I'm a follower of Jesus if I believe that he died and rose from the dead. And I don't even think there has to be a level of certainty to it. Like, there's a level at which you arrive. There's always going to be some doubt. I mean, even one of Jesus' disciples was called Doubting Thomas. There's always been an element of doubt. I really think it's okay to doubt. In fact, there's a great book I read by Greg Boyd one time called Benefit of the Doubt. And here's this PhD from Princeton who's a pastor. He went to Princeton Seminary, but he lost his faith before going to seminary because he was boxed in to this zero-sum proposition that if evolution is true, the Bible has to be wrong. And he went to his first class at the University of Minnesota as a freshman and took a biology class, and it destroyed his faith because here were good arguments for evolutionary biology. So he went through a year of just being miserable because he knew he had a real experience with God when he gave his heart to Christ. But then his certainty about his faith had then shifted from that onto being able to argue well that Genesis is literal, which blew apart in college. So having to go back and reapproach how he centered his beliefs and how he viewed doubt. And it's a great book. It's called Benefit of the Doubt by Greg Boyd.
Thanks for that recommendation.
He's also an open theist. So maybe that's why I like him.
Sure. It sounds like you read a lot of books. That's great.
But you see what I'm saying? That like there's always going to be some element of just trust at the very end.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's just to the level of I can accept this based on what I've been told. I think it's pretty intense if you claim to know the answer 100% on everything. That's bold. I've been called Doubting Thomas before. But my rebuttal to that is, wouldn't you encourage doubt? Because if you believe that this is truth, then doubt doesn't matter, because that doubt would only help you solidify these are the reasons why it's true.
I've always had the saying that I don't forget who said this, maybe it was Socrates, an unexamined belief is not worth having. Yeah, we should question everything that we believe, there's Christians listening to me, I'm speaking to them too, that all the claims of Christianity, all of them ought to be examined and questioned. Is there evidence? Is there reason for believing what we believe? I'm convinced that there's evidence that Jesus was who he said he was. So therefore I'm a Christian. But when I converted to Christianity in the boys' home, the level of evidence that I needed at that point wasn't very deep. I mean, I was going through such a dramatic point in my life that I was having this identity crisis. So there are lots of emotional and existential reasons why I probably converted. But I did need some level of like, okay, is this really true? Like what these people are telling me. If I was to rewind though and go back to when I was, 15, and the stuff that they were telling me as evidence of why it's true, I probably don't believe any of it now. They were telling me about, well, they found Noah's Ark, It's on the mountain of Ararat. And like, right. Oh, wow, that's a trip, man.
That'll be my next stop when I go to Turkey, by the way.
I think it's like a 14,000 footer or 17,000 foot mountain. It's massive. You're going to get to go there?
Yeah, I've been to Turkey 3 times, so I have a list of things that I want to see, and that's definitely on my list. Obviously, a bigger trip, but I love hiking and being out, so that seems like a cool thing. And make a lot of people jealous, I'm sure.
I think if you're given a faith, a model of faith when you're young, if you're raised in a faithful family, when you get old, you've got to reevaluate. Like, do I actually believe this myself? Is there actually good reasons for believing any of this?
Absolutely. I always think it's weird to call a child like, here's a Catholic child or something like that. My child's Catholic or something, because you don't do that with like political beliefs, It doesn't seem like politics if you just expound it to something else. Children develop their political views and views on other stuff, yet this one particular thing is told to you very early on. It's quite rigid, so I couldn't agree with you more that as you go through, it's definitely important, with whatever it is, to just evaluate where you're at and why this is something that you believe, because, who knows?
My sister-in-law has a good saying. A lot of us like to read. My wife's a big reader, and her sisters, but she says you should read against your biases. When I first heard her say that, I was still very kind of stuck in fundamentalism where I had come from. So in communities like that, you only read in group thinking. Yeah. And you sort of don't even pay attention to someone outside your bias. But man, it could be so freeing, so liberating to read from a different perspective. All of us have unexamined, we have angles that we haven't examined. We have blind spots in our thinking that we can never even discover unless we're reading people of an opposite opinion.
That's like the beauty of writing in general, is that you can get into somebody's head and they don't even have to be alive anymore. And you can feel almost what they felt or think what they think and get their perspective. The more you know, the better, in my opinion. There's nothing that I don't see any downfall to knowing more. Okay, truth hurts sometimes, but ultimately, wouldn't you want to know that? Mm-hmm. I don't know. Maybe not.
Some people are comfortable just sleepwalking through life. I don't know. As my time as a pastor, it depends on people's time in life. Like when I was ministering to teenagers, sometimes they were just comfortable not really asking any questions about life. They hadn't hit any kind of existential crisis, and they just cared about video games and their girlfriend and stuff like that. And maybe that's going to come, when they're in their 20s. But I think eventually people start asking the more deeper philosophical questions about life. But not everybody to the same extent. Like maybe some people just have a gnawing curiosity, and other people, they just need a few questions answered and they're content. They'll take action on their knowledge and go about their day. Maybe they're more just like practically minded. They'd rather think about how to, build a car or stuff I wish I knew how to do, build a house. And they don't spend so much time dwelling in the abstract. It could be a curse too, man. Especially as a business owner, and there's work I know I need to be doing, and I'm like, want to read philosophy and I want to read theology and history, and I'm like, dude, this is not making me any money, so put the book down and go edit your podcast.
Yeah. Okay, so I feel like I I think this conversation has been really beneficial, and it's refreshing.
Cool, man. Right on.
Yeah, I like your perspective a lot. It's my journey outside of Catholicism has been real eye-opening. Obviously that was many years ago, but there's so much out there. And so it's really neat to hear perspectives of people who are really thinking about their belief and evaluating and being good about that. So it's just really encouraging for me. So that's really cool. I wanted to do you have time for like one or two more?
Yeah, let's do it, man. I'm enjoying it.
Okay. I always ask my guests one very particular thing last, but I wanted to hit on one thing that you had specified in your notes as well, that you don't think that this nation should be a Christian nation. Do you want to speak about that?
Yeah, because we were talking about things I might believe that are outside of the mainstream of Christianity, the evangelical world, at least here in America. I have to go back to Greg Boyd again, who I already mentioned. He wrote a book called The Myth of a Christian Nation, which I think was a New York Times bestseller. And it was based on sermons they did at his church in St. Paul. And he did these series of sermons during a very patriotic year. I think it was an election year. I forget what was going on. But it's sort of like an anti-political involvement message. And 1,000 people left his church because of it. I think he had a church of 7,000 at the time. So anyway, the book is great, and it basically debunks this idea, this notion that we should take America back for God. The whole mantra of the religious right, the notion that America is a Christian nation or should be. And the way that he does it is he says, look, if you think about what a Christian is, and if you especially go back to Jesus, what do you see in Jesus? You see an others-oriented, self-sacrificial servant. He washes his disciples' feet. He dies on the cross for his enemies. He says, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. And the model of power that's on display in Jesus' life is servant leadership. It's power under, not power over. In fact, he talks to his disciples who were still infatuated with the way that humans think about power over. And his disciples were saying, who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom? And they were arguing about who's going to sit on his right hand and his left. And he said, you guys got it all wrong. He says, whoever's the greatest servant will be the greatest. You have to humble yourself to be exalted. He takes a child and sets the child in the midst and says, unless you become like this little child, you're not even going to enter the kingdom. So it's about humility. So this humility-oriented, others-oriented, self-sacrificial, power under model of what Christianity is. How does a nation do that? A nation has to have laws. A nation has to use violence. It has to use the power of the sword to uphold laws. A nation has to have borders. It has to enforce borders. A nation has to have an army. It has to amass wealth. Things that Christians were never told to do, Never are we told to organize an army, to go out and wage war, to shed blood, to execute people, to imprison people. So nations have to do, by definition, things that are not Christian. So it's a misnomer to say that a nation is a Christian nation. And I remember reading, I read The Audacity of Hope right before Obama got elected, because I was in, a church context in which very conservative Missouri, red state, very deeply Republican section of Missouri, and everyone was just so afraid of how Obama was going to take the country down the tubes, right? So, and as a rebel, as like a natural rebel, I always like to take the counterpoint. So if I'm around conservative people, I'm probably like the most liberal person in the room. If I'm around liberal, I'm definitely the most conservative person in the room. I'm a contrarian, I guess. So I read The Audacity of Hope, and it's a wonderful book. And I thought, this he's got something. I'm not going to tell anybody if I voted for him or not, but I'm saying the book was good. And the part in there about his conversion to Christianity was interesting. So I read that in church. I didn't tell anybody who it was, though, because we were talking about faith and politics. I'm like, hey, would you guys vote for this guy? Listen. And I read the conversion story. He talks about walking down the aisle and getting baptized. People are all nodding their heads. Yeah, that sounds pretty good. Like, who's that? Then I held the book up, and people's brains exploded at that point. But There's a section in the book where he says, turning the other cheek, what Jesus said on the Sermon on the Mount. How would that work exactly when it comes to foreign policy? I think it was a good saying, It's like, Roosevelt said, Teddy Roosevelt, we got to speak softly and carry a big stick. We got to have that big stick, and that's something that Christians are never, that's not a principle that we live by. It might be a principle for governments, but having the ability to wage war, to go out and do violence, to let the tanks roll and let the bomber and scramble the jets, like that's not something that me as a follower of Jesus is called to in my personal life. So to try to make a nation Christian, it would probably not work. All right, so you get the argument. Basically, nations by definition have to do things that are not Christian.
That's not what I was expecting, but it makes a ton of sense. So I love that, because my big thing is we're built around all sorts of different people. I mean, we're all immigrants in a way, technically, because we're this mess of different cultures. So why would you even ruin that's the beauty of America in a way. So it's really interesting. But that whole landscape right now, in my opinion, is just fascinating and interesting.
Okay. Yeah. So you thought I was going to maybe go into more of the founding of the country and.
Yeah, because even our, the founding fathers tried to set it up where there was a separation. There's a reason for that. If they wanted it to be particularly a Christian nation, they would have made it that way. But they were smart about it. They knew that people like to take power, or that you probably shouldn't mix these things because that would hurt democracy.
They had seen that model of where there's no separation between church and state in Europe. I just mentioned I read this book by Luther, about Luther. So the Protestants split away, but as you get the Holy Roman Empire, and you have basically religious power and secular power go together. Like even in Germany, or what was the patchwork of what Germany was in those days, you had bishops and you had cardinals that were also electors of the Holy Roman Empire. So here are people with church offices, spiritual leaders, who also had a lot of political power, and consequently, like, people's religious lives were regulated, in various ways. Committing adultery, which was looked at as a sin, could be punishable by death, especially if you're a woman. So Luther and the Reformers break away from the Catholic Church, and I think they were revolutionary in a lot of ways, but what they didn't change was their model of government. They still they're called magisterial reformers because they still believed that the magistrates had an obligation to enforce basically spiritual laws. But there was a radical group that said, this is ridiculous. What business does Christ have with Caesar? And what business does the cross have with the sword? And they were called Anabaptist.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. You had mentioned that earlier. I had not heard that either.
Yep. So the Anabaptists probably believed a lot of along the same lines of the Protestants, as far as sola scriptura, scripture alone, sola fide, faith alone, sola gratia, grace alone, all these things. But when it came to church governance and when it came to the state's power, they believed in a separation between church and state. And this went back to their way of viewing scripture, because they start with Jesus and they see a hard break, a discontinuity between Old Testament and New Testament. So Israel was an earthly people with an earthly covenant, whereas people in the church age are a spiritual people with a spiritual inheritance that were never, called to, have a law, have a physical palace, have a kingdom, have a standing army. So the Anabaptists, coming from that stream of thought of seeing themselves as a spiritual people, they didn't believe that they should get involved with government. And that even went so extreme as being pacifists, in some cases, or conscientious objectors. But pretty much they were committed to nonviolence. And when you fast forward to the colonies, you had some Anabaptist stream of thought people that settled, like in Rhode Island. Here you have Roger Williams and others that founded that colony because they were chased out of Massachusetts, because the early Christians that settled Massachusetts were from the Church of England, and they still had this magisterial thinking. So consequently, in Massachusetts colony, they had ecclesiastical courts where you could be punished for missing church or for committing adultery. So Roger Williams and these other Baptist thinkers were like, wait, this is what we left Europe to avoid. So they came down to Pennsylvania, which, knock on wood, is where I am right now, or to Rhode Island. Roger Williams founded Providence because he felt like God had providentially guided him there. So yeah, I think the stream of thought that the founders built on, especially Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, he was in dialogue from what I've read with the Danbury Baptist Association, who were urging upon him to have a wall of separation between church and state, because they didn't want a Church of England sort of setup where there was a state-sponsored church with ecclesiastical courts, mandatory church attendance, because they believe that people are individually accountable to God. This belief that they had individual soul liberty, that no one has a right to dictate how you worship or when you worship. And so Jefferson was in dialogue with those guys. And then, here we have in the Declaration, all men under God are created equal and are endowed by the Creator with unalienable rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. So that principle of individual soul liberty, I think, is a Christian principle, not necessarily through every stream of Christian thought, but I think it's more of an Anabaptist stream of thought, from what I've read, that influenced the founding of the country. So when it comes to the founding of the country, I do believe it was founded by a lot of secular thinkers, a lot of Christian thinkers, that it was a mixed bag, there was diversity, but I think a lot of the founding principles were taken from Christian thinking and just allowed to flourish. And of course, as a country, we know we didn't live up to this for hundreds of years about everyone's created equal under God. Did you ever read any of those books like Founding Brothers or John Adams or 1776? They were fighting about slavery from the very beginning. I mean, it was just a miracle to get all of the 13 colonies to ratify the Constitution, from what I read, because of the slavery issue. And basically what they did was just kick the can down the road. And I think it was Adams who said it would be a miracle if this didn't destroy the nation, if it didn't rend the nation when our children and our children's children have to deal with this issue. So, yeah, I mean, from the very beginning, trying to live out the principle of all men under God are created equal was hard for the country, but I think it eventually won out, thank God for that.
Yeah, I think inevitably it would. We have to live together. We have to work together in this world, and there's no getting away from it unless you're an astronaut, but you're coming back still, hopefully.
You kind of cut off there. You said after astronaut. What did you say?
You still come back, hopefully.
Yeah, you still bring your iTunes up there too. I was thinking, Josh, and if you want to pursue this or edit it out, that's fine, whatever you want to do. But I was thinking today that a lot of the way that we talk about human rights and the way that we talk about how each person's has, a unsurpassable worth, and that there's not a hierarchy. Like in the Roman world, before Jesus came, they had a saying: some men were born to rule, some were born to obey, right? They had a hierarchy. They didn't think twice about it. Obviously in their thinking, women had an inferior place, slaves had an inferior place. It was the noblemen, and then under that, everyone had a hierarchy. And then the message of Christianity was so radical because it said, no, we are all one in Christ. And in the early church, you go back and read the earliest writings, it's here you have in the same place of worship, which was often underground in the first 3 centuries. Here you have in the same place of worship, slave people, free people, Jews, Gentiles, men, women. It's like in the book of Acts in chapter 2, you see that the church starts at Pentecost, where there's all of these nations have flooded to Jerusalem for this feast. And it's like this multiculturalism at the very beginning. And they work out the Gentile question in chapter 11 of the book of Acts. But this leveling of the structures and dismantling of the hierarchy, I think also is a gift from Christianity, which has been so important to our founding. They didn't assume these things until Christ. And at least that's my best understanding. I read a book called Who is Jesus by John Ortberg. I think that's the name of that book. Who is Jesus by John Ortberg, where he kind of lays out like things that we take for granted today as being virtues that weren't always viewed that way until the message of Christ. Like, for example, forgiveness being a virtue. In the Roman world, you wouldn't You wouldn't talk about forgiveness. That's weak. It's revenge. Right. Get even. That's what a noble man does. You don't let people go, you destroy your enemies. But now we don't talk that way. We think it's more healthy as a person to let go and to be able to forgive. Stuff like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I'll leave that in.
Okay, right on, man.
I wanted to, before I forget, there's a book that was recommended to me by a good friend, Zeb. It's called Servant Leadership. And what you were describing earlier, I'm starting in the first chapter, but it's already really good read, and it's speaking towards the tones at what you were getting at, that in a way, the servant can become the leader. And that's actually the leader that we should strive for, because that's the people who are looking out for other people. And that's a pillar of functioning together, making sure everybody's taken care of, or things that are fair. So I'll throw one book out to you.
You remember who the author is?
Let me look really quick because of the internet. I was blanking. I wanted to say it, but I didn't want to misspeak. Let me just... It's a really popular one. It's older, but it seems to hold up. And actually, some phrases are really interesting because he's talking about how we get to choose a leader, and it just seems reminiscent of what happened a year ago. Robert K. Greenleaf, Servant Leadership. That was originally published in 1977.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, that's probably one of the pioneering books on it, because in my understanding, it was around that time, and even a little bit later, like into the... Yeah, I don't remember now, but around that time that servant leadership started catching on and being talked about as a model for corporations. It's fairly recent, that model of a CEO, that model of leadership has come on the scene here in America. Remember how I talked about sometimes a new idea is not that new. It's just someone unearthed it and put a good polish on it and put it in today's context.
Yeah. I see exactly what you're saying there.
It's hard to do. Like, as a leader, especially when I had like a lot of people working under me, I find myself just being a naturally selfish person sometimes with my time. Like I said, I hate to be tied down I hate to be on the clock. I love to have my schedule free. So it was always hard for me to serve as good as I needed to. And it's a weakness that I continually have to go back to. People have various hard things when it comes to following Jesus, or things that are in the Bible. That's one of the hardest things for me, is the humility part and the servant part. It goes against my stubborn nature, but that's why I realize I'm a sinner. I just have to ask people forgiveness when I mess up and keep going back to what I believe the model should be and renewing my mind with that.
Yeah, you seem like a good person, so I wouldn't get hung up on it too much. But I think the difficulty of that might be inherent from the current climate that we're in, right? You are at the top, usually, if you have more money, or money does equal power in many ways. So people are after that, or can lose sight and get after that, rather than let's see what we can do to help other people. It's kind of going this way rather than that way. So you're battling in your mind, and I imagine a ton of people listening, and myself as well, is that I want to help people, but geez, to just function and live and take care of my wife and my dog, like, there's a lot of work to just be done just to make sure that's okay. And it's kind of a weird thing, because you would think that with all of our resources and time that people could be helped a little more. We could put a little more focus into that and less on a game or something.
Yeah, and I always tell myself, it's not like it has to be a big thing. I mean, we could do small things with love that can make a big difference down the road. I really didn't realize how selfish I was until I started having kids who just suck up all the time, and energy, as every parent knows. So it revealed a lot about myself, and I hopefully I've grown a lot in grace and servant leadership. But I know with my kids, I've taken them to Disneyland. I've taken them to the beach. We've done all kinds of big fun things. But sometimes it's just like sitting down and playing chess or a game. or, just wrestling with them. Like those small things that don't require any money make the big difference for them. Just me serving them, and that's what they want to connect. And sometimes, well, not sometimes, all the time, I've always got 100 things I could be doing. Instead, they're like weighing down on me in the back of my mind, emails I have to return, deadlines. So that's where my selfish nature says, oh man, okay, all right, let's do it. All right. And then if I have this grudging attitude, how does a kid pick up on that? That's not the way to be. So for a Christian, I always, what would Jesus do? And how did he respond to people? And how did he deal with, people of all ages, all needs came to him, and he was just spent up serving others. I'll never be like that, but at least I have, example to follow.
Sure. I think you bought yourself a little bit of time in your years of, serving in the ministry. So I wouldn't feel too bad about that. You've done more than a lot of others in that realm. Okay, I have one more question for you, and then I figured I'd give you the floor and let people know how to connect with you and what you're up to. Remind them about that. But my main question with all my guests, no matter what the topic is, what would change your mind about this belief?
Which one?
Let's just say, what would change your mind to not believe in the Christian God?
Well, I think that it's pretty entrenched in me, and statistically speaking, people don't typically change their beliefs when they're 37 years old. just to be honest.
This is all hypothetical.
Yeah. What was I reading the other day about belief formation? It pretty much takes place between 18 and 24. We kind of choose our political affiliations at that time. And a lot of times our religious beliefs kind of firm up at that time. So it's hard to teach an old dog anything new, but there's a lot of peripheral stuff, of course, that I just have an open hand with. And if people have a better explanation, then I'll go with that. When it comes to like the very core of my identity, which, is a follower of Jesus, a belief like that would be a lot harder to change, because it's one of my cores of my identity. It'd be like me trying to kind of stop being a runner, or have the health opinions I do on health or nutrition. But I think that, I would like to say that I would be a reasonable enough person that if there was enough evidence, a preponderance of evidence that there is no God, that the questions that we have as human beings about morality and destiny and purpose and meaning are better answered in a empty universe in which there's no intelligent life, and we're all basically the source of truth in ourselves, not out of ourselves. So in other words, like the philosophical questions, the existential questions that we struggle with, I feel like Christianity does a better job at answering. If I felt like a belief in no God did a better job, I would like to think I would change my mind. But when it comes down to it, like I said, it's really kind of probably a stretch that I would ever change my mind this far in the game. But who knows?
Yeah, I think it's good to be open like you are. I would imagine that's maybe a more common thing, is that, I'm rooted, but obviously if there's enough evidence, sure, maybe. Yeah, same with me.
Well, for me, it goes back to the resurrection of Jesus. That's sort of the central point on which all the other beliefs hang. In fact, there's a quote, 1 Corinthians 15, when Paul is talking about the resurrection. He says, "If Jesus be not raised from the dead, then our faith is in vain, our preaching is in vain. All those who have died trusting in the resurrection have died without hope." So it's like the one foundation on which everything rests.
Kind of like Ken Ham and the 6-day creation for him. It's that without the resurrection, the rest might not hold water.
Yeah. I don't think this one's a false dilemma, though. I think this is a real dilemma, because if you deny the reality of the resurrection, then you might still have some sort of religion. But at that point, I don't know if you could call yourself a biblical Christian. Like, you could be something else, and that's fine if people want to be something else. You could be maybe like a deist, like Thomas Jefferson. But as far as like a follower of Jesus, a biblical Christian, like the Apostles' Creed kind of stuff would be like the meat of it. And I always explain it this way. Like, you ever played Jenga? There are certain blocks you can just feel. Those are pillar blocks. You try to move that one, the whole tower is going to fall. And then other ones come out fine, or maybe like a little finessing, they'll come out. Well, there's certain like Apostles' Creed stuff, Jesus being who he said he was, the resurrection from the dead, the Bible being God's word, that are like those Jenga blocks that I think the whole tower would fall down. We wouldn't really have faith in anything at that point. Our system of belief is kind of hung on that. So for me, I could hear evidence about the earth being billions of years old and having evolved, and that's fine. I think there's other ways to interpret Genesis. I can hear evidence about various books of the Bible being written later, or having the various authors, source criticism, form criticism. I could read a lot of that. I could take a lot of that in and not really affect my faith, because at the core of my belief, that one Jenga block that's holding all together is, do I believe that there is sufficient evidence that Jesus rose from the dead, at least a preponderance enough that I say, yeah, there's definitely something here that I then can commit. Will I have total certainty? No. Tim Keller describes it like hiring a personal assistant. Like, let's say you had to hire a secretary, and this person gave you a great resume, and you did your due diligence. You looked into their background, references. Maybe you called, you really investigated this person. But how do you know if they're actually going to work out well as your secretary until you finally just commit? You can look at all the good reasons why they would be a good candidate, but you never know until you finally trust. And I feel like that's kind of what Christianity calls upon us to do. Like, there are points of evidence, there are reasons, that have been laid out for nothing that I've invented, but just arguments put forward for this stuff that, people can research and read. But at some point you just got to commit to know. And for me, I think if there was new evidence or new arguments that really trivialized the arguments for the reality of the resurrection of Jesus, that would be the hardest thing, for me. That would be what would tip me over, that there's other causes that better explain the phenomenon of the church and the New Testament and the dramatic shift that occurred after the resurrection. There's a book. Now, if anybody really wants to wade deep, this is not the time or place for me to try to lay out arguments, but read N.T. Wright, Resurrection of the Son of God. It's about 900 pages, pretty much the seminal work of New Testament scholarship on the resurrection. N.T. Wright is a British scholar. I think he's in Oxford. Another great book as far as the reliability of the Gospels, because we know a lot of our source material comes from the Gospels. So the reliability of the Gospels is another British scholar. I think he might be at Oxford too. His name is Richard Bauckham, and he's got a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, which is just brilliant. And then one more, if people just want maybe an introduction to this stuff, Tim Keller, The Reason for God, and also Making Sense of God, those two books. Keller's such a great writer, and he knows a lot of, he's such an egghead. This is what I would like to be like, Josh. He's such an egghead that he retains knowledge, and he's read just a multitude of disciplines, science, philosophy, and theology, and he can synthesize it all in one conversation. Like, I don't have time to do that, I wish I could say I've read all the classics, and I've read Nietzsche, and I've read all these philosophers, but no, man, I'll just have to get someone who synthesizes it and sort of regurgitates it for me in a more compact, until my kids are grown at least, and I have time to read all this stuff.
Sure, yeah. At least we have those options now.
That's true. That's true. Back in the day, you just go to the library and muscle through. You couldn't search. Yeah, what an amazing time in which we live. But thanks for the opportunity to talk about what I believe and stuff I'm passionate about, and you're a great interviewer too. These questions have been fantastic. Oh, right on. I've really enjoyed our conversation, so thank you for coming on. It's been a really big pleasure and sort of unexpected as far as the person who I thought I'd be interviewing for this topic. So it's just really cool, and I think this was a really productive conversation that hopefully whoever's listening or watching will come away with thinking more about whatever it is. So I wanted to give you the last word. I like to give the last word as far as advice or final thoughts, but really maybe something tangible. What's nice is you just referenced a lot of books, which is fantastic. But anything else as far as our topic? And then if you want to plug what you're doing and how people can connect with you, the floor is yours. Hey, all right. I'll take another hour. No, I'm just kidding. I guess I would tell people what I have found to be helpful for me in my journey is just remember that no belief that's unexamined is worth holding to, and don't be afraid to read against your biases, because we all have blind spots in our thinking, and it's a great way to expand our minds. So no matter what worldview you come from, the one thing I firmly believe in is confirmation bias, and it's so easy just to every day you just read the news sources and listen to the podcast and read the books that confirm our own biases, because that's what's comfortable. And it's not comfortable to hear the other side. It literally causes us mental distress, but it's necessary, to have the courage to give the other side a fair listening to. And I think that's continues to be helpful for me. And as far as where to find me online, there's not anywhere you can find me where I talk about all this stuff. But if you're interested in running and marathon training, we'd love to have you come over to our websites, marathontrainingacademy.com. Or if you just want to Google MTA podcast, Marathon Training Academy, don't think MTA is the transportation system. I think they beat us to it, but MTA podcast, just Google that and we'll show up probably as a top result. And we have a show that's been going since 2010, 238 episodes, 238 just about to roll out, and over 6 million downloads since we started. So we're really blessed and have a great audience and doing the podcast thing full time.
Congratulations on all that. That's amazing.
I have an amazing co-host, my wife.
I'll definitely make sure to provide links in the show notes and make sure to share all of that information so people can connect with it. I also run, not marathons, but I love to run, so I'm going to be listening in to try to pick up on some tricks, because I'm sure I've formed bad habits. But what I'll do is I'll put on your podcast while I'm running.
Perfect.
Thanks again, Trevor. Take care.
All right, you too, Josh. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to episode 5 of The Belief Books. And thank you, Trevor, for coming on the podcast and telling your story, and for the refreshing conversation. It really was. Happy podcasting. You can listen to Trevor's podcast at marathontrainingacademy.com. I highly recommend it, and I can't wait to get better at running from it. So thanks, guys. I'll put links in the show notes on thebeliefbooks.com on this episode's page. Leave a review on iTunes, connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, or directly on the website. You can find me on the Theology Corner network, which is a network of theological-themed blogs and podcasts. So I'm on there with over 40 other contributors digging into our beliefs. Check out my page at theologycorner.net/thebeliefbooks. You can pretty much find me anywhere with searching The Belief Books. I also just recently launched the official forums for The Belief Books called The Belief Forum. Just request to join on Facebook. You can search on there. You should find it. Or just send me your email and I can invite you directly. The email is beliefbooks@gmail.com. That's a closed group, by the way, where deeper discussions can happen that may be sparked by the conversations that I have here on the podcast. Or we can explore any other topic that you want to explore with the group. No matter where you find me, though, or if you find me, just make sure to keep the conversation going. I'll see you on the next episode of The Belief Books.